The world remembers generals for their battles and kings for their thrones, but few remember the man who shook nations from a wooden chair before dawn. His name was Edward McKendree Bounds, a quiet preacher whose weapon was prayer. While others built churches with bricks, he built them with tears. While others studied methods, he studied the heart of God. Born in the dust of Missouri, forged in the fire of the Civil War, and buried in the silence of a Georgia town, his life left no monuments, only manuscripts soaked in eternity. Each morning before sunrise, a small lamp glowed in his window. Neighbors said they could hear him praying, whispering names, pleading for souls, until heaven itself seemed to lean low to listen. He never sought fame. He never led an army, but through prayer, he touched the throne that governs both. This is the story of a man who proved that one life, fully yielded in prayer, can outlive empires, outshine pulpits, and still call the church, even today, back to its knees. The year was 1835, and the small frontier town of Shelbyville, Missouri, sat nestled between rolling hills and quiet streams. It was a place of hard soil and harder winters, where men tilled the land from sunrise to dusk, and families gathered by firelight to read from the worn pages of the Bible. In a modest wooden cabin on August 15, a child was born. Edward McKendree Bounds, the fifth of 6 children to Thomas Bounds, a sturdy farmer of English descent, and Hester Bounds, a gentle mother whose prayers filled their home like music. From his earliest days, little Edward absorbed the rhythm of faith through his mother's quiet example. She prayed in whispers that rose like incense, asking God to make her children instruments of righteousness. Her voice, soft but steady, left an imprint deeper than any sermon. Edward grew up learning endurance before he could spell the word. He herded cattle, chopped wood, and carried buckets from the creek. But amid this ruggedness was a tenderness. Evenings when his mother would open the family Bible and read, "Pray without ceasing." Those words stayed with him long after childhood ended. By his teenage years, Edward showed unusual intelligence. Books fascinated him. While other boys chased squirrels or traded tobacco, he devoured every scrap of writing he could find. History, sermons, and the rare legal texts that made their way to Shelbyville. He spoke little, observed much, and had an inner restlessness that seemed to search for purpose. At 14, he apprenticed in a small law office, sweeping floors by day and studying statutes by night. The discipline of logic suited him. Law promised stability, dignity, and influence, everything a young man might desire. By his early 20s, he had passed the bar and begun practicing as an attorney in Monticello, Missouri. Those who met him described him as courteous, deliberate, and unusually calm for his age. But success brought no peace. The courthouse felt hollow compared with the church pew. Each verdict won seemed to leave a deeper question unsolved. Sometimes, late at night, he walked through the sleeping town and whispered into the wind, "Lord, is this all there is?" One evening, after returning from court, he entered his room, knelt beside the bed, and prayed as he never had before. He confessed not just his sins, but his self-reliance, the pride that thought education could substitute for revelation. He later wrote, "When man is filled with himself, he cannot be filled with God." That night marked his turning point. A peace he could not explain flooded his heart. The following Sunday, he stood in a small Methodist meeting house and publicly surrendered to Christ. Friends were stunned, clients puzzled. How could a promising young lawyer abandon a career for an uncertain ministry? Yet Edward could only reply, "I have found a greater court, and its judge is holy." He joined the Methodist Episcopal Church South, a denomination known for holiness preaching and missionary zeal. His pastor recognized his seriousness and encouraged him to prepare for ministry. The young convert threw himself into study with the same rigor he once gave to law. He read the Bible daily from cover to cover, not as a scholar, but as a man starving for truth. Commentaries, Wesley's sermons, and biographies of early Methodists filled his small room. But what transformed him most were the dawn hours he spent alone with God. He began waking before sunrise, kneeling beside a wooden chair, praying until light filtered through the shutters. His journal from that period contained a single repeated line: "A preacher must first be a man of prayer, else his words are dead leaves." In 1859, the Methodist authorities granted Edward McKendree Bounds a license to preach. He was 24. His first assignment was Monticello Circuit, a cluster of small rural congregations scattered across Missouri's farmlands. Traveling on horseback, he carried a well-worn Bible, a hymn book, and little else. The roads were rough, the pay meager, but he preached as if eternity hung on every word. He was not a fiery orator in the worldly sense. His power came from quiet conviction. When he spoke of God, it felt as though heaven had drawn near. People said his prayers could melt stone. During one winter service, held in a drafty log chapel, he prayed for nearly an hour before preaching. The congregation, moved to tears, later testified that revival began that very night. Bounds did not plan revival. He simply prayed until God came. Yet as his ministry grew, the nation darkened. The 1850s bled into the 1860s, and America stood on the brink of civil war. Missouri's towns were torn between loyalty to the Union and sympathy for the Confederacy. Churches split, neighbors quarreled, families divided. Bounds, though Southern by geography, cared less for politics than for souls. He believed that war was man's failure to pray. Still, when conflict erupted, he felt compelled to serve the suffering. He accepted a position as chaplain to the Confederate Army, not out of militancy, but out of mercy. Before leaving, he wrote to a friend, "I go to carry prayer where bullets fall. Soldiers need Christ as much as civilians." The journey south was perilous. Bands of soldiers roamed the roads, and suspicion fell on anyone carrying a Bible. Burned fields stretched where crops once stood, and broken wagons littered the roads like skeletons of hope. In this grim landscape, Edward McKendree Bounds, the young chaplain who carried no weapon but faith, moved among soldiers in the Confederate camp with the calm of a shepherd. The Confederate camp near Franklin, Tennessee, was a miserable patch of mud and misery. Frost bit through the thin tents. Men coughed blood and cried for mothers long dead. Bounds walked among them like a quiet physician of souls. Each dawn he rose before the bugle, found a lonely spot by a tree or beside the river, and prayed until the first light broke. Soldiers often awoke to see him kneeling in the cold fog, motionless except for the breath rising like steam. Some mocked him gently, calling him the man who prays the sun-up. But soon even the mockers came for counsel. He prayed for the wounded, comforted the fearful, and buried the dead with trembling voice. His compassion knew no rank. He knelt beside privates and colonels alike. "Chaplain," one dying man whispered, "will God forgive me even now?" Bounds clasped his hand. "If you call, he will run." In March 1863, tragedy struck. During a Union raid near Franklin, Bounds was taken prisoner. He carried only his Bible and a few letters for soldiers' families. Yet suspicion branded him a Confederate sympathizer. Dragged to St. Louis, he was thrown into Gratiot Street Prison, a gray fortress of stone and iron that reeked of sickness. Hundreds of men were crammed into small rooms, their spirits broken by hunger and humiliation. The guards demanded that each prisoner swear allegiance to the Union to gain release. Many complied. Bounds did not. "I cannot serve two masters," he told the officer. "My allegiance is to the kingdom that shall have no end." He was confined to a damp cell, his bed a wooden plank, his food little more than scraps. Yet those months became a furnace where his theology turned to fire. He prayed when others cursed. He gave away his rations to weaker inmates. He shared the gospel with guards who sneered, and a few quietly returned to him for prayer at night. In his journal, he wrote words that would later echo in his books. "Trouble and prayer are close companions. Great souls are made in the school of suffering. The praying spirit grows in prison as in palace." What began as isolation became ministry. Soon prisoners gathered around him in the dim corners of the barracks to hear scripture. He read from Philippians, "Rejoice in the Lord always." "How can we rejoice in chains?" one asked. "Because Christ was chained for us," he replied. Months stretched into a year. Letters from home were scarce. Disease spread. Several inmates died in his arms. Yet Bounds never lost serenity. When asked how he endured, he said, "By praying more than talking." He recorded prayers on torn scraps of paper, many of which survived and later formed the seed of his classic works. One note read, "O God, make me a man of prayer. Let no circumstance rob me of communion. If prison walls shut me in, open heaven wider still." This secret communion sustained him. In 1865, as the war drew to its bloody close, the captives were freed. Bounds walked out of Gratiot Street Prison, gaunt, pale, and weak, but his eyes shone with unearthly light. A fellow minister who met him described him as one who had wrestled with angels and prevailed. He returned to Missouri, but home no longer felt like home. The nation lay in ashes. Families were torn apart. Churches divided, and hatred still burned hotter than summer sun. Yet, Bounds saw not destruction, but opportunity. He resumed pastoral work, this time in Franklin, Tennessee, a town he had come to love during his chaplaincy. However, the town lay wounded. Half its young men were gone, houses burned, churches roofless. The congregation he had once served met in a damaged wooden chapel with cracked windows and pews made from split logs. People came in torn coats, still wearing the sorrow of years. On his first Sunday back, Bounds climbed the pulpit slowly, looked over the weary faces, and said quietly, "We cannot rebuild these walls until we rebuild these hearts. Let us begin where revival always begins, on our knees." He then knelt on the floorboards and the congregation followed. What began as silence became weeping. What began as weeping became prayer. That moment marked the rebirth not just of a church, but of a people. Bounds' new rhythm of life shocked even the devout. He rose at 4 o'clock each morning, long before dawn, to pray. When asked why he prayed so early, he said, "I must talk to God before I talk to men. The day belongs to those who win it in prayer." His prayer life became legendary. Within a year, the lifeless town began to stir. Families who had abandoned church returned. Prayer meetings multiplied in homes and barns. The sound of singing once again drifted down Main Street. Outsiders noticed something strange about Franklin: peace. Merchants who once cheated now prayed before opening shop. Former soldiers reconciled over communion. Bounds never called it revival. He simply called it obedience. When prayer becomes the atmosphere of a community, he said, revival is its climate. He organized early morning intercession circles. Sometimes only 2 or 3 attended, but he insisted that God begins with the few who truly pray. In time, the gatherings filled the church. Farmers knelt beside merchants, black freedmen beside white soldiers, an image of unity rare in post-war America. Amid this work, Bounds built a small family. His marriage brought quiet joy after years of solitude. Those who knew him remembered the gentle way he read scripture aloud at breakfast, and how the Bounds home always smelled of bread and books. Children from the neighborhood often wandered in uninvited. His wife simply smiled and set another plate. Their home was a living parable of grace. He kept no money beyond what he needed. Once, when given an unexpected gift, he divided it into envelopes labeled "for the poor," "for widows," "for orphans." Prayer, he said, that does not open the hand will never open heaven. By 1868, reports of revival in Franklin reached neighboring towns. Invitations poured in for Bounds to preach. He traveled by horse across Tennessee and Georgia, sometimes sleeping outdoors, always praying as he rode. In each place, his message was the same: holiness through prayer. During these years, Bounds began to jot notes in small leather journals. He carried them everywhere, recording thoughts that flashed during prayer. Prayer is the greatest of all human employments. We are beggars who hold the keys of the treasury. Preaching without prayer is performance. Preaching with prayer is power. These fragments would later form the bones of his books. But at the time, he wrote for himself to keep his soul awake. "If I stop praying," he said, "I stop breathing." However, revival did not shield him from sorrow. Illness struck his household more than once. He buried loved ones quietly, sometimes preaching their funerals himself. Yet grief drove him deeper into communion with God. He told a friend, "Sorrow has been my greatest teacher. I learned that God's comfort is not relief, but presence." By 1870, Franklin had changed beyond recognition. Tavern owners turned their businesses into stores, family feuds ended. Sunday schools overflowed. Travelers who passed through often lingered for worship, claiming they could feel peace in the very air. Bounds attributed none of it to organization. He wrote, "The church is not an institution. It is a habitation of God. When prayer fills it, God dwells there." In 1875, the Methodist Conference transferred him to other towns, Nashville, Shelbyville, and beyond. Everywhere he went, the pattern repeated: humble beginnings, fervent intercession, and quiet awakening. He trained young ministers to value the prayer closet more than the pulpit. Some later confessed that an hour in prayer with Bounds taught them more than a semester of theology. He reminded them, "You cannot kindle fire in others until it first burns in you." Then, the Methodist leadership invited Bounds to join the staff of the St. Louis Christian Advocate, the denomination's newspaper. Its readership spanned the South and Midwest, and the editors hoped his voice might rekindle devotion among ministers grown mechanical. He accepted without hesitation. "Print," he said, "is another pulpit." His first day at the office astonished the staff. Before touching a pen, he knelt beside his desk and prayed aloud for guidance. Reporters paused mid-conversation. One whispered, "He's praying over editorials." Indeed, he was. He prayed before writing each article, after proofreading, and again before mailing the issue to press. His column soon bore the title, "Prayer and the Preacher." Week after week, he pled for ministers to trade polish for power. He warned against intellectual pride and spiritual laziness, writing lines that cut like chisels. "We are breeding preachers who love crowds but not closets, who polish sermons but neglect souls." The letters poured in, some grateful, others offended. One minister wrote angrily that Bounds' standards were unrealistic in the modern age. Bounds replied with only a verse: "Men ought always to pray and not to faint." St. Louis was both opportunity and opposition. City pastors admired Bounds privately but feared his public rebukes. He accused the church of seeking applause rather than anointing, saying, "Entertainment is the devil's substitute for earnestness." Some mocked him as old-fashioned. But gradually his consistency silenced critics. He prayed for them by name, and several later became his allies. His small rented room became a sanctuary. He owned almost nothing, just a cot, a Bible, and stacks of papers tied with string. Visitors found him cheerful but otherworldly. One journalist recalled, "It felt as if the noise of the city could not cross his doorway." During these years, his friendship with Homer W. Hodge deepened. Hodge, younger and energetic, recognized in Bounds a saint the world might otherwise overlook. Together they spent evenings praying over stacks of correspondence, asking God to ignite hearts through the printed page. Through his St. Louis years, Bounds continued itinerant ministry on weekends. He visited small congregations across the Midwest, preaching with the same gentleness that had marked his Franklin days. He urged believers to pray not for prosperity, but for purity. In city missions, he ministered to the poor, often slipping his meager pay into their hands before walking home empty-pocket. He believed charity and prayer were twins. Intercession without compassion is only words. Years of travel and fasting weakened his body. He suffered from chronic chest pain and occasional fainting spells. Doctors advised rest. He smiled and replied, "I shall rest in heaven." Still he pressed on, fueled by invisible strength. When pain forced him to pause mid-sermon, he would lean on the pulpit and whisper, "Lord, preach through me." By 1894, Bounds knew his time in St. Louis was closing. His editorials had accomplished their work. The church had heard his cry. He longed again for quiet and prayer. When offered a comfortable retirement position, he declined. "I must return to the secret place," he said. "The city has many preachers. It needs men of prayer." He left the bustling streets behind, moving southward once more to Washington, Georgia, where he would spend his final years in solitude, writing the books that would circle the globe. On his last morning in the Advocate office, he prayed with the staff, thanking God for ink that can carry fire. In Georgia, he rented a small white house on a quiet street where vines climbed the porch rails and the scent of magnolia drifted through the windows. Neighbors soon noticed his habits. Before dawn, a faint light appeared in his study. By sunrise, the sound of prayer, soft, rhythmic, unhurried, flowed through the open shutters. Sometimes he paced, sometimes he knelt motionless for hours. Children walking to school whispered, "That's the praying man." His days followed holy simplicity. Pray, write, visit, pray again. He owned little besides books, paper, and a teapot. He never hurried, never worried. When friends urged him to travel or rest, he smiled, "I rest best in prayer." In that modest room, beneath the flicker of an oil lamp, he poured his soul onto paper. The pages that would become the weapon of prayer, the necessity of prayer, the reality of prayer and praying men were born there, written not for publication, but as living devotion. Every paragraph carried the breath of intercession. He often began a manuscript by reading scripture aloud, then kneeling beside his chair, "Lord, teach me what I should write." Hours later, he would rise, pen in hand, and record what his heart had heard. He wrote without haste, as though heaven itself set the rhythm. His handwriting was careful, looping, almost pastoral. Margins overflowed with notes. Pray more deeply here. Expand with example. Omit vanity. Each draft ended with a signature prayer. Use these words, O Lord, to awaken your sleeping church. Though retired from the circuit, Bounds continued to pastor quietly. He led early morning prayer circles at the Methodist Church, often attended by laborers before work. Some came sleepy and distracted. He would wait in silence until the room stilled, then whisper, "Let us talk with God." Within minutes, the atmosphere changed. Hardened men wept freely. He visited the sick, prayed over school children, and counseled young ministers who traveled miles to meet him. They expected advice on preaching. He gave them lessons on the inner life. "Preach less, pray more," he said. "Your words may reach their ears, but your prayers reach their hearts before you ever speak." Washington, Georgia, seemed an unlikely center of revival, yet visitors left transformed. Missionaries on furlough spent nights in his home and returned overseas renewed. No advertisement announced these gatherings. There were no posters, no campaigns, only prayer. And still souls came. They came weary and left aflame. One pastor wrote afterward, "I went to see an old man and found a doorway to heaven." Bounds corresponded widely during these years. His letters, short, handwritten, warm, often contained no small talk, only encouragement to pray. To a discouraged preacher, he wrote, "Faith weeps before it wins. Do not measure results, measure obedience. God's delays are not denials. He waits to make you mighty in prayer." Meanwhile, Homer W. Hodge, his faithful friend from the Christian Advocate, visited often, collecting and organizing Bounds' writings. He pleaded with the old man to allow publication. Bounds hesitated. "These are my meditations with God. They are not fit for markets." Hodge insisted they belong to the church. Finally, Bounds relented on one condition: publish them only if you first pray over every page. Hodge promised. Together they spent hours reading aloud, editing between bursts of prayer. When Hodge later published the volumes after Bounds' death, he testified, "They were already sanctified by prayer before they ever saw print." By now his hair was snow white, his frame thin, but his eyes, those eyes, shone with childlike brightness. Some days he could scarcely climb the stairs, yet weakness only deepened his dependence. He often quoted, "When I am weak, then am I strong." If illness confined him to bed, he called it a longer audience with the King. Nurses recalled that even in fever, he prayed aloud for missionaries and the nation. He refused to fear death. "I am already with Christ," he said softly. "Heaven will merely be seeing what I have long felt." By 1907, word of his writings spread quietly. Manuscripts circulated among seminaries and camp meetings. Ministers copied pages by hand. A generation of revivalists, unknown to him, fed daily on his words. Lines like, "Prayer is not preparation for the greater work. Prayer is the greater work," began appearing in sermons across America. Bounds himself remained unaware of his rising influence. When told that his articles had inspired young missionaries, he smiled. "Then the seed has found soil. I care not who waters, only that God gives increase." In 1911, neighbors still woke to the sound of his voice before sunrise. Even with trembling hands, he rose from bed, lit his lamp, and whispered names before the Lord. He prayed for pastors he would never meet, for nations he would never see, for generations yet unborn. When asked why he prayed so much, he smiled, because eternity is long and time is short. Yet old age pressed heavily upon him. Rheumatism stiffened his knees, his eyesight dimmed. But when friends urged him to rest, he only laughed softly. "Rest," he said. "I am resting while I pray." He prayed sitting when he could no longer kneel, whispered when he could no longer speak clearly. Homer W. Hodge visited often, gathering the final manuscripts. Together they sorted piles of handwritten pages, sermons, reflections, meditations, each line saturated with prayer. Hodge begged him to publish more. Bounds shook his head. "Let God choose when they speak," he said. "I have only written what he has shown." In the summer of 1913, sickness confined him to bed. He grew thin, yet peace surrounded him like sunlight through a curtain. He asked that his Bible remain open on the table by his pillow. When pain came, he would rest his hand upon it and whisper, "Still true." On the night of August 23rd, a small group of friends gathered at his bedside. He thanked each quietly, blessing them by name. To one young pastor he said, "Keep the altar of prayer burning. Let no man's opinion quench it." Then he asked to be left alone a while to finish talking with God. At dawn, August 24, 1913, when the first rays touched the window pane, the praying man fell silent. His Bible lay open to the words, "And the prayer of faith shall save the sick." He had simply crossed from prayer into presence. There was no grandeur in his burial, just a handful of neighbors, ministers, and friends. They sang softly, "Sweet Hour of Prayer." After his death, Homer W. Hodge kept his promise. He compiled and published the manuscripts Bounds had left behind. The first book, Power Through Prayer, appeared shortly after his death. It spread quickly among pastors, then across oceans. Soon came The Weapon of Prayer, Purpose in Prayer, Prayer and Praying Men, and others. Each carried the unmistakable voice of the man who had lived what he wrote. Preachers quoted him in pulpits, missionaries packed his books beside their Bibles, and revivalists from Leonard Ravenhill to Samuel Chadwick called him their teacher, though they had never met. Ravenhill would later say, "E.M.Bounds is one of the few who still makes me prayer." As decades passed, his name became synonymous with prayer. His words, written in candlelight, crossed generations. Prayer makes a godly man and puts within him the mind of Christ. Talking to men for God is a great thing, but talking to God for men is greater still. God shapes the world by prayer. Churches formed study groups around his writings. Missionaries read him in jungles and cities alike. When revivals erupted in the early 20th century, his books were often found on the prayer benches of those who led them. Even now, more than a century later, his sentences still ring like bells, calling believers to their knees. Imagine that quiet Georgia house again, the lamp glowing before dawn, the old man whispering names into eternity. He is gone, yet that glow remains. Every believer who kneels today continues the conversation he never finished. His books are his footprints, leading us to the same secret place. When history measures greatness, it often looks for monuments or armies. E.M.Bounds left neither. He left something greater, a path to God worn smooth by prayer. And somewhere beyond the veil, the apostle of prayer still kneels before the throne he loved so much, his earthly whisper now joined to eternal praise, a reminder that the man who prays truly never dies.